Among the more than 2,500 cases examined by Ian Stevenson throughout his career, few in Europe contained as many verifiable elements as that of the French girl who claimed to remember the death of a soldier in the Second World War. The episode, included in the collection European Cases of the Reincarnation Type, 2003, stood out for something rare in Western accounts: dates, names, and places that could be cross-referenced with historical records. The narrative begins in 1967 near Dijon, in eastern France. Claire, the only child of two teachers, was 3 years old when she began waking up in the middle of the night, crying and articulating words in German, a language absent from the family's daily life. When consoled, she repeated a recurring image: "I froze in the snow far from home." At first, her father interpreted the episodes as typical childhood night terrors. The repetition and precision, however, imposed caution. On a trip to Alsace, a French region with Germanic cultural roots, the girl became distressed upon hearing a band play old marches. She leaned against her mother and said, "They are returning from the front." The spontaneous use of the front, a reference to the battlefield, left the couple bewildered. Other pieces of the same puzzle gradually emerged: an aversion to military uniforms, anxiety around airplanes, loose phrases like "I wore heavy boots" and "My name was Karl Mayer." Given the consistency, the parents started a diary with the date, time, and literal transcription of her statements. In 1971, upon reading about Ian Stevenson's research at the University of Virginia in the journal Psychiatrie et Conscience, the father wrote to the department he directed. Stevenson responded with interest and sent a meticulous questionnaire, a standard step before any field visit. The following year, 1972, he landed in France and stayed with the family for 3 days. He recorded interviews, checked the parents' notes, and directly observed the girl, who was then 8 years old. In the researcher's notes, Claire spoke naturally about "my other life," mentioning scenes of combat, a snow-covered field, and a village called Tannenfeld. True to his method, Stevenson avoided quick inferences. He first sought to confirm if a place with that name existed and if military archives linked Karl Mayer to casualties in the region. The check of German documents yielded a concrete fact. A soldier named Karl-Heinz Mayer, a native of Freiburg, was listed as missing in action in January 1945, in a sector then less than 80 kilometers from Dijon. The finding did not end the matter, but it raised the level of the investigation. For the first time, a name spoken by a French child had a precedent in military records dated from the end of the war. Back in the United States, Stevenson took over 30 pages of notes and cassette tapes. The case caught his attention not only for the number of details, but also for the clarity with which the girls separated the two identities. "Now I am Claire, but before I was Karl," she repeated. For the researcher, this distinction, recurrent in some accounts, deserved scrutiny. From then on, the investigation would connect spontaneous memory, war trauma, and documentary verification, a path that, without promising definitive conclusions, aimed to measure the extent of the facts against the available hypotheses. Before returning to France, Ian Stevenson reached out to contacts in Germany to gather data on the alleged soldier. In Freiburg, the local historian Hans Oehler agreed to collaborate voluntarily. He scoured war archives, family correspondence preserved in the Bundesarchiv, and municipal records from the time. In April 1973, he sent Stevenson a copy of the military record for a Corporal Karl-Heinz Mayer of the 198th Infantry Division, who disappeared during the German retreat toward Colmar in the winter of 1945. The document described shrapnel wounds and probable death in an open field, under intense snow, details that echoed Claire's words. With these partial confirmations, Stevenson returned to France in the fall of 1973. He found the girl, then 9, more talkative and precise. She described a man wounded in the leg, trying to reach his comrades amidst a snowstorm until he fell near a stone house and heard French voices before losing consciousness. To test the reliability of the memory, Stevenson applied the procedure that would make him a global reference: the confrontation of spontaneous recollections with verifiable data. He showed the child photographs of villages in Alsace and the Franco-German border. Faced with one of them, Amersfoort, north of Colmar, Claire reacted immediately. "It was here. I've been here. I died here." Cautiously, Stevenson recorded the scene in his field diary. This could be genuine recognition or unconscious suggestion. Even so, he classified the episode as an indication of significant consistency. During one of the interviews, the girl surprised him by describing the interior of a typical Alsatian house: the iron stove, the linen curtains, a narrow wooden staircase. Upon visiting the region, the researcher found a dwelling with such characteristics a few kilometers from the point where, according to military reports, Maya was last seen. Stevenson also interviewed elderly residents, including a woman who had sheltered wounded soldiers in 1945. She recalled a blonde young man, a southern German accent, who did not survive the night. She could not remember the name, but the portrait matched the description given by the girl. Convinced of the need for formal documentation, Stevenson dedicated months to writing the dossier that would, decades later, form the French chapter of European cases of the reincarnation type. In his preliminary conclusions, he maintained the cautious tone that marked his method. The elements described suggest continuity of memory, but do not constitute conclusive proof. Between 1974 and 1976, Stevenson maintained regular correspondence with the family, observing Claire's development. Instead of weakening, as occurred in other cases, her memories intensified. At the age of 11, she began drawing uniforms and insignia of German troops from 1944 with a precision that intrigued the researcher. In one of the illustrations, she faithfully reproduced the shape of the badge worn by the Wehrmacht, saying, "I had this on my jacket, near my heart." Stevenson noted that the girl had never had contact with military or historical material at home, which made the detail particularly relevant. During a visit in 1976, the researcher administered another test. He displayed photographs of objects from the 1940s, watches, utensils, landscapes, and anonymous soldiers. Claire pointed to the image of a pocket watch and affirmed, "This was mine. It was with me when I died." Stevenson later verified that the object had indeed belonged to Karl-Heinz Meyer and was returned to his family after the conflict. Having not shown the girl the photo beforehand, he considered the correct identification a remarkable example of a controlled coincidence. In his notes, Stevenson reflected, "The European cases are less susceptible to cultural or religious interpretations, which gives them greater scientific value. When a French child reports memories of a German soldier, we are confronted with something that transcends beliefs and borders." By the end of 1976, Claire went through a phase of great emotional sensitivity. She would cry when watching news about wars and felt guilt for something she couldn't fix. Stevenson interpreted this phase as a fusion between residual memories and the girl's psychological maturation, a phenomenon he had already observed in documented cases in India and Lebanon. In 1977, he concluded the case report, classifying it as one of the most coherent in his European series, but he maintained his usual prudence. The evidence suggests, it does not prove. The following year, with Stevenson's consent, the parents decided to take Claire to Germany. The trip was purely academic, an opportunity to observe if visiting the mentioned locations would provoke spontaneous reactions. The researcher, unable to accompany them, sent detailed instructions. Every observation should be recorded with the time, location, temperature, and the child's facial description, avoiding any suggestion. The journey began in Freiburg, the soldier Karl-Heinz Meyer's hometown. Right in the first few days, something caught their attention. Walking through the old part of the city, Claire stopped in front of a house rebuilt after the war and said, "There was a shoe shop here." The smell of leather was strong. Back at the hotel, the parents checked a local historical guide, which confirmed that the Meyer family shoemaker's shop had indeed operated there until 1944. The detail was carefully documented and sent to Stevenson, who replied with a short but significant observation, "The field correlations are consistent. The case deserves permanent record." In Colmar, already on the French border, Claire became agitated upon seeing an open field covered in snow. "It was near here, I fell here," she murmured. Fearing a more intense reaction, the parents cut the visit short and returned to Dijon. Days later, they sent the notes and photos to Stevenson, who, upon reviewing them, described the shoemaker episode as one of the most objective correlations ever observed between verbal recollections and verifiable historical data. To confirm this, he asked Euler to locate business records from the time. The historian replied with copies from 1939, proving the exact existence and address of the shop. These discoveries attracted the interest of other European scholars, including the Swiss psychologist Hans Nageli Osjord, a frequent collaborator of Stevenson. The two exchanged long letters about the cultural significance of the case, a French child remembering the life of a German soldier, a memory that crossed the trauma of the post-war period. For Nageli Osjord, the episode represented a form of symbolic reconciliation. Stevenson, although cautious, replied, "Perhaps it is a rare example of psychological continuity beyond the separation between victims and combatants." After their return, Claire's parents decided to preserve their daughter's privacy. They declined invitations from journalists and radio programs, and Stevenson fully respected this choice. In publications, he used only initials and omitted city names. When decades later, the case would be included in the print edition of European Cases of the Reincarnation Type, 2003, more than 30 years had passed since the first contact. The account, written in the sober style that characterized Stevenson, concluded with a reflection: "Memory may survive the body, but science is still trying to understand how." The story of Claire, the French girl who claimed to remember a life as a German soldier, thus became one of the most intriguing chapters of Stevenson's career and a landmark in the scientific investigation of memory and identity. In Ian Stevenson's personal files, now preserved at the University of Virginia, Claire's case occupies just 2 thin dossiers: yellowed sheets, tape transcripts, and some black and white photographs. Even so, it is one of the most commented on records by scholars of consciousness and post-mortem memory. In notes dated 1980, Stevenson observed, "The clarity and consistency of this case remain remarkable, especially given the absence of cultural factors to explain it." After the presentation of preliminary excerpts at conferences, the case began circulating in academic circles in France and Germany. Some researchers treated it as evidence worthy of analysis. Others, with skepticism, attributed Claire's memories to indirect family influence or memory disorders. Stevenson, true to his style, avoided any polarization. In an interview with the BBC in 1982, he stated calmly, "The task of science is to observe what happens, not to judge whether it should happen." In that same year, Claire turned 18 and entered university. She became interested in psychology, perhaps motivated by a desire to understand her own experience. In a letter from 1983, cited in later publications, she wrote, "The memories are more distant, as if they belong to someone I read about in a book. But when I hear German, I still feel it is my language, my..." Stevenson considered this progressive detachment a recurring pattern in genuine cases. As the individual matures, spontaneous memories become secondary recollections, echoes of what was once lived. Throughout the 1980s, the Claire case was mentioned in seminars and articles, including an edition of the Journal of Scientific Exploration, where Stevenson revisited his original notes. His stance contrasted with the growing European sensationalism surrounding paranormal phenomena. He insisted, "I do not seek to prove reincarnation, but to show facts that materialism does not explain." In 1989, Claire returned to Germany for the last time, accompanied by a small French documentary team. She visited the Colmar region again. Standing in front of the field where, according to records, Karl-Heinz Meyer was last seen, she remained silent for long minutes. Then she said, "Now I know I can leave this here." The group noticed that she seemed relieved. Upon receiving the report, Stevenson included the scene in his final notes on the case. Over time, Claire built a private life. She married, had children, and never sought notoriety. For Stevenson, her journey symbolized what he called borderless memories, recollections that cross cultures and identities without turning into belief. The case, he concluded, did not represent a miracle, but a reminder of the complexity of the human spirit and the invisible scars left by European history. In the 1990s, while Stevenson was consolidating his international reputation, the Clare case continued to be a reference among his most consistent studies, both for the robustness of the data and for the symbolic delicacy. A French girl who remembered being a German soldier, an unlikely link between peoples who were still healing the wounds of war. In 1992, already widely recognized as a pioneer in the study of so-called spontaneous past life memories, Ian Stevenson was invited to give a lecture in Bern, Switzerland, about European cases. Before an audience of psychologists and philosophers, he mentioned without revealing names, a young French woman who recalled the death of a German soldier in 1945. He presented the case technically, highlighting three essential points: the chronological coherence of the accounts, the absence of personal gain or public exposure by the family, and the documentary correspondence between memories and historical records. Among the listeners was the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, who, after the presentation, commented that perhaps it was not just a case of reincarnation, but an echo of transgenerational collective guilt. Stevenson did not respond directly. In his conference notes, he merely recorded, "The moral hypothesis is interesting, but lacks an empirical basis." This distinction between the observable and the symbolic would be a constant in his method, always rigorous, always resistant to mystical interpretations. In the following years, Stevenson expanded his database with cases from Ireland, Sweden, and Poland. Even so, Clare's case remained a paradigmatic example, balancing evidence and prudence. He frequently cited it in lectures and articles as a model of controlled investigation, free from exaggeration and ideological intent. In 1997, the family authorized the publication of a summarized version of the study in the special edition 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation, European Addendum. Stevenson, then 79, personally revised the text. In the preface, he reaffirmed the principle that had guided him from the beginning. The hypothesis of the survival of individual memory remains the most parsimonious explanation for the coherence between verbal recollections and observable facts. Meanwhile, Clare lived discreetly in the French countryside, away from public attention. In anonymous conversations with researchers associated with Stevenson, she expressed serenity when recalling the past. "I no longer feel pain. It's just something I carry with me. Maybe we all carry memories that are not ours." This phrase moved Stevenson, who highlighted it in his notes as a rare example of successful psychological integration. In other similar cases, the conflict between identities resulted in anxiety or confusion. In Clare's case, there was a kind of silent reconciliation. In the final years of his career, Stevenson began to reflect on the historical impact of his research. In a lecture in London in 2001, he declared, "If even a small part of these memories is authentic, then we are faced with a continuity of consciousness that transcends biology." A few months later, he would review the definitive manuscript of European cases of the reincarnation type, where the Clare case would appear among the French chapters, a study without final conclusions, but with questions that continued to resonate. The publication in 2003 would mark the conclusion of more than 4 decades of work and consolidate Stevenson's name as a global reference in the scientific study of reincarnation. When European Cases of the Reincarnation Type was finally published in 2003, Ian Stevenson was about to turn 85. His reputation was consolidated, and the book, the result of more than 40 years of systematic research, was received with respect and caution. The chapter on the French cases included Clare's dossier, presented with the same neutral and analytical tone as always. The academic critique was divided. Some praised the rigor and scientific courage, others accused him of attributing spiritual meanings to psychological coincidences. Stevenson responded with sobriety. The phenomenon needs to be studied, not labeled. Among those who revisited the case was the German psychologist Dieter Hassler, interested in memory patterns without a cultural basis. For him, Claire's story represented a rare European example of a memory without religious contamination. The family did not hold spiritualist beliefs which, according to Hassler, reinforced the authenticity of the phenomena. In 2004, in a letter exchanged with Stevenson, the German researcher wrote, "The precision of Claire's recollections about Alsace and military life is unlikely to have been learned indirectly, especially by a child in a civilian environment." Stevenson, true to the prudence that had accompanied him throughout his career, replied, "I agree that the improbability is high, but we must maintain methodological doubt until the end." By this time, Claire was living in Lyon, teaching literature. She rarely granted interviews, but maintained discreet contact with some researchers interested in the psychological aspect of her experience. In one of the few recorded conversations, she stated, "I don't care if they call it reincarnation or inherited memory. To me, it was real enough to change the way I see life and death." The phrase was included with her authorization in the supplementary notes sent to Jim B. Tucker, Stevenson's successor at the University of Virginia. Stevenson himself saw in this testimony a symbol of balance, someone who had transformed an unusual experience not into a belief, but into a reflection. Between 2005 and 2006, already weakened, Stevenson reviewed part of his archives, preparing what would be his final legacy. In a letter to a Scottish colleague, he wrote, "The French case of Claire B remains among the most solid I have observed, not because it proves anything, but because it resists simplistic denial. The absence of personal gain, the temporal consistency, and the emotional depth make it an example of rare authenticity." In the last months of his life, he continued working discreetly in Charlottesville, reviewing notes and correspondence. He passed away on February 8, 2007, leaving a monumental collection and a debate that would cross the boundaries between science and spirituality. After his death, several researchers returned to the archives in search of new understandings, and Claire's case was repeatedly cited as a paradigm, a bridge between individual memory, history, and mystery. Decades later, the words of the French girl who claimed to have died in the snow still echoed among the pages of reports and old tapes, reminding us that, for Stevenson, the essential question was never to prove reincarnation, but to understand the extent of what the human mind can retain, even when life seems to have come to an end. After Ian Stevenson's death, the vast collection of his studies was catalogued under the supervision of Jim B. Tucker, his successor at the University of Virginia. Among hundreds of reports, tapes, and correspondences was the dossier titled France-Germany Case 1967-1977. Subject: Claire B. Possible Memories of the Life of Karl-Heinz Meyer. The material included original letters from Claire's parents, interview recordings, and Stevenson's handwritten notes with observations such as rare emotional consistency and possible residual trauma from a previous life. Tucker maintained the commitment not to reinterpret the content. In a 2009 article in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, he wrote, "Stevenson's objectivity did not reside in proving reincarnation, but in the courage to consider the hypothesis without religious premises." He cited the Claire B case as an example of emotional neutrality and documentary rigor. The text reignited academic interest in the topic, now with new approaches from cognitive science and transgenerational psychology. Meanwhile, Claire's real name remained unknown to the public. Living discreetly in the French countryside, she avoided associations with spiritualist movements that tried to claim her story. In 2010, she granted a rare interview to a German researcher. In it, she maintained the serenity that had accompanied her since youth. "As a child, I said I died in the snow. Today, I understand that it was just a memory that passed through me and that taught me to respect suffering that is not just our own." During the dialogue, The researcher noted that Claire naturally alternated between French and German, with surprising fluency for someone without formal training in the language. Laughing, she commented, "Perhaps language belongs to no one, just like memories." The phrase was later cited at a conference in Berlin on consciousness and identity, becoming a symbolic epilogue to the case. In the following years, the study was reinterpreted through different lenses. Some neuroscientists suggested epigenetic hypotheses, the possibility of traumatic memories being transmitted across generations. Others, aligned with Stevenson's line of thought, maintained that the phenomenon exceeded known biological explanations. Despite the divergences, the consensus was undeniable. No other European case presented such extensive documentation and such rigorous verification controls. In 2015 in Freiburg, memory history researchers organized a small exhibition titled Recollection and Identity. One of the panels was dedicated to Karl-Heinz Meyer, the soldier missing in January 1945. Among the documents displayed, a fragment of a letter written by his mother lamented never having received her son's body. The words, imbued with pain and farewell, resembled the phrases Claire had spoken as a child. Visitors reported emotion in the face of this coincidence of voices, that of a mother and that of a girl, separated by decades, but united by the same feeling of incompleteness. The Claire B. case thus ceased to be just a study on reincarnation and became a mirror of European collective memory, a reminder that the boundaries between history, trauma, and identity are more porous than we suppose. Today, the Claire dossier rests among the silent shelves of the University of Virginia archives, accessible only to authorized researchers. Inside it, typewritten pages, handwritten notes, and magnetic tapes form a mosaic of half a century of investigation. On the envelope cover, written in Ian Stevenson's precise handwriting, is France-Germany Case, 1967-1977. Subject, Claire. Possible memories of the life of Karl-Heinz Meyer. Right below, a final observation. If there is a bridge between life and death, perhaps it is made of memories. The phrase summarizes, with the sobriety that characterized him, the ultimate meaning of his quest. Stevenson never wanted to prove dogmas. He wanted to understand how certain memories, devoid of personal or cultural context, could cross generations and bodies. The Claire case was the most refined example of this tension between the measurable and the mystery. Since the digitization of the archives, the study has again inspired a new generation of scientists interested in anomalous memory, identity, and emotional inheritance. Some use it as a reference for research on collective traumas. Others cite it in debates about consciousness and neuroplasticity. In 2020, a Franco-German group of psychologists compared the case with contemporary accounts of transgenerational memories in descendants of victims and veterans of the Second World War. The similarity of expressions, the cold, the guilt, the snowy scenery, was interpreted not as proof of the soul's survival, but as evidence of the emotional persistence of the European past. Still, among parapsychology scholars, the name Claire remains a symbol of an exemplary investigation, not for what it explains, but for what resists being explained. Stevenson always insisted that each case should be treated as a historical document, not as a narrative of faith. Therefore, his methodology, recorded interviews, data cross-referencing, control of suggestion, became a standard of reference in subsequent studies on memory and consciousness. As for Claire herself, little is known beyond her desire for anonymity. She lived discreetly, teaching literature, raising children, and avoiding any form of exposure. On the rare occasions she wrote about the subject, she maintained the same serene tone as her childhood statements. "I don't believe I was someone. But I do believe that memories also have a destination. They find somewhere to land." This phrase, noted by a German researcher in 2012, accurately concludes the human dimension of the case. What began as a mystery about life and death transformed into a reflection on memory and empathy, about what remains when time erases the name and the body, but not the feeling of having been. More than half a century later, The enigma of that child who awoke at night shouting words in German continues to echo discreetly among scholars, psychologists, and historians. Not as evidence of reincarnation, but as a reminder that forgetfulness may never be complete. Thus ends the case of Claire, the French girl and the German soldier, preserved with the precision of a scientist and the humanity of someone who saw in the inexplicable not an answer, but a question that consciousness has not yet managed to silence.